Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. In this episode, I talk with Geoff Holsclaw about why Facebook arguments are like heroin, understanding the ways our brains work, and when we should have enemies. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Geoff Holsclaw. Welcome to the podcast, Geoff.
Hey, glad to be here.
Now, I know that you wear a lot of different hats, and I don't think I could do justice to try and introduce all the hats that you wear. So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, where you live, where you're from. Who is Geoff Holsclaw?
Who is Geoff Holsclaw? Well, I'm always quick to let people know that I'm originally from California. My heart is still from California, from the Bay Area. But I've lived most of my adult life in Chicago. I moved there. That's where you and I actually met way back in the day. I moved there in 2000 for school. And then I ended up pastoring there for about 15 plus years at a church called Life in the Vine that someone else had planted, Dave Fitch. And then totally against my will, I ended up getting a doctorate. And so I also started teaching at Northern Seminary down there in Chicago, which has been great. So I've been teaching there for several years. So I was pastoring, I was a professor, I have a family, I have teenage kids. My son just started driving. It's crazy.
Wow.
But just about a year ago, God called us from Chicagoland. We were in the northwest suburbs to Grand Rapids, Michigan. We joined a Vineyard Church. And so my wife and I are joined the pastoral staff there. And so that was been a big change. Thankfully I still got to teach a little bit, and so we're getting used to Grand Rapids. So that's some of it.
Yeah.
So I love to write. I have a blog, and actually my wife and I are thinking of starting a podcast. So that's coming down the pipeline too.
Cool. Yeah. Well, I like to ask this question. I don't always ask this question, but I find it's interesting to hear kind of people's stories about growing up, and it helps you kind of get a little bit of background. What did you learn about conflict growing up? What was that like for you growing up?
I was all for it, all for the conflict.
Okay.
My family was very pro communication.
Yeah.
At least in conflict. So we learned so yelling was normal.
Okay.
But in the sense of, so I have an older brother, an older sister, and then a twin brother. So I would punch my brother a lot, my twin brother. It's so things never got like kicked under the table. That was always like, let's talk about them. I mean, certainly some things you don't talk about, but, so that's kind of the framework that I was raised with, was you just go after it. And I think I had this kind of special advantage actually being a twin. Like, I think there is this kind of, when you have someone who's your own age and is with you all the time, there is like a certain communicative kind of patterns that like are ingrained in you. And so like, I think I'm very wanting to communicate and argue and debate and things like that. So I don't know.
Yeah. Interesting.
Not necessarily healthy, but at least talk and
yeah, it's different. And we all find out as we get into relationships, and especially marriage relationships, that not everybody came with the same styles of communication and grew up with the same ideas around conflict that we did. So it's interesting to hear
true.
where different people come from.
Yeah, my wife was totally freaked out when she visited my whole family for the first time on Thanksgiving, because her family, and this will probably get into, some of the stuff we could talk about, but her family was raised, she was like from a Dutch family, very proper, very reserved. And this is not a joke, but, like around the family dinners, you would talk about the weather, and you talk about sports.
Yeah.
You would literally talk about the meals you had earlier that week, like super boring. She comes to my family, there's long table, everyone's talking over each other. You don't talk one at a time. Everyone's having their own multiple conversations, and you butt in on the other conversation that you weren't a part of because you heard something that was interesting, and you just go for it. And she was like totally overwhelmed.
Yeah.
By the way we communicated.
Yeah. Well, the thing that kind of piqued my interest is you had this post recently on Facebook about how maybe we are addicted to hating our enemies. And you said this: because of the release of adrenaline and dopamine in response to an enemy, we get a short high, a rush, when we interact with them. And many of us are addicted to hating our enemies because of this. So tell me a little bit about, what do you know about the brain science behind that? I mean, I think it's somewhat common knowledge about addictions and dopamine, but was there something you read that kind of triggered this idea of, maybe we're addicted to hating our enemies?
Well, yeah, I've been going like in the last couple of years, gone down this deep dive of like neuroscience and spiritual formation. So someone like Kurt Thompson in The Anatomy of the Soul, or he also has a book called The Soul of Shame. And he's like a therapist who has done a lot of brain research as well as spiritual formation and Christian counseling and things like that. So he was one, and I've been reading, all sorts of things, about the addictive personality. And my wife and I have been working on this book all about the presence of God. But, for whatever reason, I was just kind of led into some of this brain science research. And, there really are these fight or flight responses that we get, in the presence of an enemy that are kind of non-cognitive, but bodily, visceral. You get, certain releases. And this is also an online interaction too. And so people get these kind of like spikes in adrenaline just by like Facebook posts, which is why everybody gets, and especially Twitter, right? You get so amped up, and there's all these bad neurological reinforcement patterns that we get through social media and other things. That our brains, and maybe addicted isn't the right word, but there's this saying in neuroscience that the neurons that fire together wire together. So the more often that we allow our thoughts to travel down certain pathways, the stronger those get, and the more likely they'll refire in that same order. Same pattern is probably the more technical term. So we're constantly training ourselves, I think, down these bad paths. And I was just reflecting about how Jesus commands us to pray for our enemies. And I was kind of thinking through that, not as like a spiritual formation practice, but as kind of a more literal, like brain transformation process. If we can hold our enemy before us, at least in our minds, and they're not actually there and they're not threatening us as if we're actually threatened by somebody on Facebook, right? But, that's how
it feels that way, right?
Yeah, right. Our whole, like, they're against everything. They're ruining our lives, for Trump, against Trump, blah, blah, blah. But if you could hold this person in your mind, this enemy, and maybe it's not Facebook, right? That's kind of the easy kind of kill thing to kind of beat. But, the someone, like coworker that kind of slandered you or took credit for your idea or thing like that, and you're just kind of holding, jerk. And so, like, if we're in a strictly kind of neuroscience way, but if we're to hold that person into our minds and then connect them with positive thoughts like blessings, so you're praying for them, what would that do neurologically to you? Well, long term, you're not going to have a fight or flight response to them because you're actually training your brain to connect good things with them. So they become more like a friend in your mind. You literally, I was thinking like that Jesus tells us to pray for our enemies. It's kind of like tricking our brains into treating them like a friend eventually. Yeah. So that when you see them, the next time you see them over the water cooler, and Jesus is literally talking about the Roman soldiers who could have killed one of your relatives, right? So, he is talking about people that have killed your people.
Right.
How then could you react? So you pray for them without them being there, and then maybe eventually you could actually interact with them as a person rather than as an enemy. So I was just thinking through those things, and I think that's kind of where that post came from.
Yeah.
how can these spiritual practices be also understood as neurological transformations?
Yeah. Well,
That's a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Boom.
that's great. No, that's great. That's very, very good. I recently finished reading the book In Search of Hungry Ghosts by Gabor Mate, which is all about addiction. And, you seemed a little hesitant to use the term addiction. And one thing I really liked in his book was this idea that we all have our own addictive processes, and that's almost a natural function of the human brain to fill in whatever gaps we have with something, right, that stimulates it. Some can be very, very destructive and damaging, like drug addiction, alcohol addiction, things like that. Others seem somewhat maybe what's the word I'm looking for? Like not destructive. They're sort of
almost, well, he calls them behavioral addictions, but they're almost like petty. Like, so he often talks about he often talks about his addiction to classical CD buying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's funny that we both read the same book. I love that book too. That was amazing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he talks about just behavioral addictions. But the brain doesn't realize that you're not like injecting a chemical, you're not doing heroin. Mm-hmm. But in the one sense, behavioral addictions still affect the brain in very similar ways. Is kind of his point. And so he says it's right. It's still an addiction because your brain is firing and craving and distorting reality, even if you're just at, a record shop flipping through CDs.
Right. Yeah. And I saw, I think a meme, just today about coffee, talking about, I need my morning socially acceptable, addiction in order to function, we have these addictions that are acceptable, right? So his addiction to buying classical music is acceptable, socially. And it's sort of the same with Facebook and what you're saying. When we hate our enemies more and more, we've created this space or the idea that it's okay for us to hate our enemies, or that rush is that addiction to maybe it's feeling good about some cutting comment you left on somebody's post or whatever. We feel justified, and we don't feel like it's a destructive addiction. But I think what I appreciated about what you're saying is, no, it is similar to other addictions in that it's destructive behavior that we are sort of rewarding ourselves with this rush of adrenaline or the feeling that we get when we engage with people we disagree with. And then we kind of get addicted to the rush of battle, right? Verbal comment battle that we're having. Yeah. There's a couple different cartoons that I was thinking of, and I wish I had a file for all these, the witty memes and cartoons. But there's one where, whoever does all the stick figure drawings, and this wife's calling from the bedroom, "Are you coming to bed yet?" And this guy's hunched over a keyboard, and he's like, "Someone said something stupid on the internet. I cannot rest until it's fixed." Yeah, exactly. And it's just like we have this kind of like, no, until so and so's idiotic response has been thoroughly torn down and shown to be folly. Like, I can't tear myself away from my phone. It's like, like what's happening there? Yeah. And one thing I think that has come up a lot as I've been doing interviews for the podcast is this idea of getting curious about other people and getting curious about ourselves, and how do we try to find and cultivate that space in our lives? Because when we engage people online and something happens that triggers our response, that fight or flight response, to get curious about why do I feel that way is a much different response than to just plunge, head into the battle as a gladiator. You're just going to go in there and win. How do we pause long enough to get curious about what's happening with us? That's probably the hardest thing for me personally to do. If I'm engaged in a conversation, if something has happened that has gotten me into a conversation online where I feel like I feel a need to say something, I do have that feeling of I need to follow it through to the end until someone is either convinced on my side, or I feel like I've in some sense been victorious. However I define that.
Yeah, for sure. It's so ingrained. And I think, we could just keep going down the brain science rabbit hole, but there is a sense. So Dan Siegel, he talks, he has a book called The Connected Kid? I always say it wrong. And I'm at my church office and all my brain science books are in my home office. So I'm like looking at commentaries. These aren't the right books. But he has a giant book called The Developing Mind. But he has a couple other books that talk about kids and connecting and things like that. But he talks about how really the brain seeks integration, integration like top to bottom. So that goes from like your brain stem, which kind of does your automatic kind of breathing and heart rate and stuff. And it's also where the fight or flight impulses come from first. And then your middle brain, a lot of your emotions. And then the top of your brain is like your executive thinking and your maps and patterns. And he says, when the brain is functioning well, and he calls this well-being or happiness, he's like, vertically you're integrated and horizontally. So your left brain and your right brain are properly connected. But he talks about when you have this like a strong emotional surge, he talks about flipping your lid. And he talks about how, in one sense, the bottom or the middle of your brain stops communicating with really your identity center. It stops communicating with your executive functioning and your planning center, and it's just running around, the proverbial chicken with its head cut off. And so he says a lot of times we flip our lids, and so we're in a disintegrated sense, and we are not acting out of our true selves or from our true values and things like that. I think we run across people like that, quite a bit, even ourselves. We do function that way. So we're literally disintegrated. And so Kurt Thompson, who I was talking about the anatomy of the soul, in that book, he talks about how in a real sense, having the mind of Christ is having an integrated mind. It's Christ is giving us, the option and the reality through the Spirit to have a fully integrated mind where you don't have to flip your lid, or if you do, you can kind of become reintegrated or brought back to peace is kind of the Christian word. Can you find peace and rest in your mind, first of all, so that you can find peace and rest in your relationships? And so how can we become people who could, so they talk about, like, have you ever been with somebody, or maybe this is yourself or your listeners, where something really hard happens, you enter into an argument, or someone kind of like they lose it on you or you lose it on somebody else. And afterwards you're like, man, I felt out of control. Or you say, I felt like that person just turned into someone else. Like, have you ever had that experience? Like, oh, that person turned into someone else. Like, we were talking and then something happened and they're not making any sense. And that's the idea of like being disintegrated, where you're not, you're running back to a previous memory or previous fear, and you're no longer kind of engaging in the present. You're kind of lost in the past and things like that. How do we, and maybe we could even relate that to Romans 7, right? So how does, I do what I do not want to do, and I do not do what I want to do. And this all goes back to our brains integrated, or they're disintegrated.
Yeah, no, I love that. And keep the brain science coming. It's really helpful, I think, for us to understand what is happening to us. I think a lot of times we're on autopilot. We aren't aware of the what you're talking about is happening. We just have the feelings, we have the reactions, we have the clenched fists, the tight chest, or whatever the body feelings are that you have when you feel that rush of adrenaline or whatever you're feeling in response. And so being able to recognize this is happening in my brain. This is naming it even, this is disintegration, helps us be able to name it and then be able to sort of take a step back. It sort of helps bring us down and move towards integration, like you're talking about. I think that's so helpful.
Well, and like what you said, can we know it's in our brain? And that's kind of the first step, is because our brain is telling us, no, the problem is outside of us. The problem is that person, or the problem is, this situation, or the speeding car, or someone almost ran over me. And so our brains are constantly, this is kind of the survival mentality, right? Like some things are out to kill us, and I need to be vigilant. Otherwise I might die. I might fall in a hole. I might get, bitten or eaten by a tiger or killed by an enemy arrow, right? But so our bodies and our minds respond with, I just got hit by a literal flaming arrow, when, technically most of us have not been shot at by a literal flaming arrow, at least not recently, depending on the neighborhoods you grew up in. So for some, that is true. Like you do have to be hypovigilant because your life is on the line. But for others, that's not the case. And so but our body, there is no difference. The bodily response is no different.
Yeah. And, I have learned a lot about anxiety and the way that the mind functions with anxiety. And a lot of people suffer from anxiety disorders and things like that, where, it's your brain saying you're going to die. Like if you stand up in front of this class and give a talk, or if you do something social that brings you anxiety, you're going to die. And that it's really, your amygdala sort of taking over and trying to protect you, trying to take care of you. And one technique I've heard a counselor say is, for kids, for example, giving your amygdala a name, and then you start talking to it and say, hey, Amy, chill out. I got this. We're not in danger. And you can actually kind of take a back seat. It's thank you for trying to protect me, but it's actually not life and death right now.
This is what I do with a lot of people is I try to have people have more compassion for themselves. Because a lot of times people will get into a situation, be like, oh, I hate it when I do that, or I'm so, or why do I do this? And trying to be like, hey, your brain got wired that way for a reason at some point. Like maybe you got in a car crash when you were 3, maybe your dad was abusive, and you needed to be afraid. And maybe, and your brain, and not just your brain, but like your whole nervous system has like grown around those feelings going to early childhood, but even like things, adult traumas. Right. And so just being compassionate, like, hey, the fact that you lost it on your kids, like have compassion for yourself because you were only modeled to be an angry dad. That's what your dad did. That's what you do. Okay. So just name that, have a little compassion, and then try to figure out, so how can we keep moving forward? But a lot of times, and I even do this with myself, I just get so down on myself. Why do I keep sinning? I shouldn't do that. I know I should do that. And then I keep doing that. And I've just told people, like just have compassion. Like, yep, you did that. But that's in your body. That's in your brain. You don't want to do that. But now let's figure out creative solutions for, how to keep moving forward. So that's, for me, learning this brain science stuff has helped me have more compassion for myself, to have more compassion for others. And then I try to help people to, have compassion. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter, right? We do want to treat our children better. We want to treat, our loved ones better, and we don't want to be acting out of the past.
Another book that I read this year was by the psychologist who created the therapy process of EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I think that's what it stands for.
I don't know what it stands for, but I know what it is.
Yeah. And I before
where is that book? What is the?
Oh, now I'm gonna have to find it. It's called.
I haven't read it.
It's called
is
Getting.
It the body
No, it's called Getting Past Your Past.
Oh,
I think that's what it's called. I'm pretty sure.
I haven't read it. There's also another book called The Body Keeps Score. That's like, my wife has it. She's going through spiritual direction training, and she's got that book and she's been reading it. It's been really good, but it's very similar, I think. So what about the EMDR?
Yeah. Well, for people who haven't heard of EMDR, it can be kind of a little shocking or strange the first time you either hear about it or even if you experience it. I have used it in therapy. And the very first time I was like, this is so strange. In some form or fashion, you stimulate both halves of your brain. And so they'll use a light that goes back and forth maybe, or buzzers in your hand that alternately buzz in your left hand and your right hand, while you are thinking through traumatic memories and things like that. There's a whole the book explains very well like the whole process. And it seems very strange and foreign the first time you hear about it, but it's actually backed by more science, more studies than any other method that's used in therapy that I'm aware of. I could be wrong about that, but I know that there's a lot of very solid science behind how that method reprocesses memories, traumatic memories, or memories that are just kind of stuck when something happens and it's stuck in your brain. When your brain isn't able to integrate that into your memories in a way that's healthy, like taking the good lessons and being able to leave the things that are harmful or were traumatic, then you kind of keep coming back to that memory, even if you're not realizing it. So you come back to that same feeling, right? You keep if you notice, like, why do I have this feeling when somebody says something about X or whatever? And a lot of times it is, like you were saying earlier, tied to other things in our lives that we haven't necessarily processed yet. And it could be from childhood. It could be from later on in life. The work of being able to learn how to do what we're talking about, which the idea is loving our enemies, involves a lot of work in ourselves, being able to process what brings up the hate in us, what brings up the things that cause us to be angry and to respond and to have those sorts of reactions. And so I just think that's really, really important. You were saying a lot of times we like to externalize the problem or what's happening. Like I'm angry because somebody else did something. The car cut me off. The person said something dumb on Facebook. But realizing that our reactions really have to do a lot more with what's going on with us internally. And one thing I feel like I've learned this year is realizing not everyone responds the same to the same stimulus, right? So not everybody gets mad when somebody says something on Facebook. Some people are able to like go, well, whatever, it's Facebook. I don't understand those people, like I want to get into verbal debates, but that was a revelation to me, right? Like you don't have to respond that way. That's also a choice or a certain response that you can learn about and work on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's difficult because emotions work kind of on two different levels. There are the more automatic emotions that kind of so you can talk about like emotions that kind of move up your brain and then the ones that move down. So the ones that kind of move up your body and connected to fight or flight or positive arousal, like that's bad, that's going to kill me, that's good, I want more of that chocolate, beautiful person, blah blah blah, right? So it can be impulses that draw you, attract you to something, or impulses that propel you away from something. But those are emotions, you call them shame, anger, fear, excitement, joy, love. But then there's also kind of the more, those are like spontaneous emotions, that keep us alive or that keep us drawn towards things that sustain life or protect life, things like that. But then there's the downward emotions that we do have more choice about, where they're connected with thoughts and intentions. And I was just preaching a couple of weeks ago on the story of Cain and Abel and how, Cain offers something to God, a sacrifice, but it wasn't the first fruits. It wasn't the best of the things he had, like Abel did. And God celebrates Abel and kind of goes, to Cain, right? Any person is going to feel bad if that happens, right? If you're a kid at school and they celebrate, your friend, and the teacher is like, oh, Geoff, like, thanks, right? You're going to feel bad. Or if, your parents did that, or if a boss like celebrates, someone on the team and then looks at you and is like, so you're going to feel bad. Like you can't control that response. So Cain gets into this funk, right? And it says his face turns down, and connecting with eyes and faces is like a huge neurological kind of thing. Like from about 6 months on, like babies are constantly looking for other eyes, and that there's this kind of connection and attachment between faces and eyes, right? So the scripture says his face was downcast. And so he is feeling disconnected. He's feeling disintegrated, disconnected relationally, but also within himself. He's probably feeling shame on the one hand. I got rejected by the person I wanted to impress. Then he's feeling a little bit of spontaneous jealousy, like my brother got something better. That jerk, he always outdoes me, right? How come he got to go second? If I'd gone second, I would have had a better, or whatever, right? But then it's interesting that God comes and connects with him, and starts asking questions. Why are you so angry, right? So I think you were talking about being curious, right? How can we become curious? Well, God, same with Adam and Eve. Where are you, right? He starts with questions. So God doesn't go after us and be like, you blew it, you suck. He's like, well, where are you, Adam and Eve? Why? Tell me about this anger, because that's if we can talk about our emotions, then we become in control of our emotions again, is often how people, this is part of the process of like remetabolizing these out of control emotions. So, but God says it, this is what Genesis 4, he doesn't say that Cain had sinned because he didn't bring a great offering. Like, so something happened, there's some sort of relational disconnection, but there's not sin there. So those feelings that are bubbling up in Cain are not because he sinned. there's some relational disconnection. But what does he say? He says, sin is crouching at your door and it wants to devour. Mm-hmm. And so God is pinpointing, like, you had these spontaneous emotions that ran up your nervous system, and now you're telling yourself a story in your mind about what happened. Yeah. And that story is going to lead towards sin or not. Because that story that Cain spun is God probably doesn't like me, or God's unfair. Yeah. And that Abel cheated, or he's like, he did something, and this is the mind externalizing the problem. So these bad feelings I'm feeling are not related to me. They're someone else. Yeah. And so he moves into the sin, right? He kills his brother, right? But he didn't have to do that if he could have told himself a different story. And God was trying to. He was saying, hey, if you do what's right, you know, instead of what you're about to do, which is kill your brother, don't you know you'll be accepted, right? But he didn't live in that story. He lived into the other story. And so our thoughts and our emotions are connected. So sometimes I get frustrated with people who are like, oh, they're my emotions, I have no control over them. It's like, that is half true. Yeah. So like, Kurt Thompson, when he talks about shame in his book, The Anatomy of the Soul, he says, if you're just a person and you're walking down the street, well, we'll go to junior high. Can we all go back to junior high? Imagine you're at junior high, right? So you struggle with insecurity. You're not sure where your place is in the world. You're walking down the street, and a group of kids that you know start laughing hysterically. If you're walking by and you say, and you interpret their action, so you give it a story and you say, they're laughing at me. How are you going to feel? That story is going to create an emotional response in your entire body, which is, I do not feel good. I'm going to get angry. I'm going to get ashamed. I want to get back at, you know, Bobby, who always says bad stuff, whatever, right? So now you're telling yourself a bunch of stories, and you've created in yourself a bunch of feelings because they're laughing at me. Now, if you just were walking by and a group of people that you knew started laughing, and you told yourself, oh, they must be looking at a funny meme. Now how do you feel? Well, you might not feel any worse. You certainly won't feel any worse. Maybe you even start feeling better. Yeah. You're happy because they're happy. And so this is, you know, so our minds and our bodies and our emotions, it's all connected. So how do we, and it's confusing. Yeah.
Yeah. When we're thinking about these things that trigger the reactions maybe, and then now what do we do with it? You know, one thing I often say to my kids when they're having conflicts or feeling mad about something, or I often say to them, your emotions are not wrong. No matter what emotion you feel, emotions are just emotions. That's just what you feel. We have to work on, like, what am I going to do with this emotion, right? An emotion is just a reaction to the stimulus, and could be for a lot of different reasons. And like you're saying, there are ways that if you want to have a different emotion, maybe you can work on ways to change that. But we often get messages of shame just about emotions in general, like we're not supposed to have them, or certain emotions are really bad and that sort of thing. So I think just saying emotions are emotions, and we need to pay attention to them, but they're not bad just because you got angry about something, or because you felt good about something that maybe you think you're not supposed to feel good about, or whatever, right? Those are just the emotions. So what do? We've had this reaction. We read something on Facebook. We read a tweet by the president, or we read somebody that doesn't like our candidate, or whatever it is, or somebody says something that we don't agree with about any number of topics, right? You know, you mentioned like Jesus' advice to pray. What are some other things, tricks of the trade that we can do from neuroscience and from faith that can help us get through those things, manage them in a way that's better, and be more compassionate?
Yeah, now you're getting practical. My goodness. I think I would just say maybe like asking yourself, being curious about yourself first. Like, what if this goes unanswered, or if this was true, or maybe the fact that it's blatantly false? Like, what am I afraid of because of this? Like what is it that, you know, is being stirred in me, and trying to find, and just trying to name that. Yeah. And then asking does it need to be, especially on Facebook, like, does this need to be overturned? And usually when it comes to Facebook, usually the answer is probably no. Like, well, you could probably just let it go. I think my experiences with personal relationships is when I get really angry, I wait long enough to figure out what I'm sad about.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something I'm mourning over myself that my anger is trying to protect, and that's why I'm like directed toward them? Or is there something in them that I'm sad about, that if it doesn't get addressed or talked about, that is detrimental? Like, how can I move it from I'm just mad or angry because of X, Y, and Z to like, what am I sad about? Like that the world is broken. Mm-hmm. Because I usually am in the place of like, well, anger is bad. Mm-hmm. And like you said, like I've tried to reframe that, like, no, anger, at least at its best, mm-hmm. it says, there's an ideal for this relationship and it's not being fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And that is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. So like at its best, I think anger is supposed to be telling us that, which is why I would connect it also to sadness. Mm-hmm. So anger is like the high energy version of this relationship, mm-hmm. or the world itself is not as it should be. Mm-hmm. And sadness is maybe the low energy kind of way. Yeah. And the flip side for the positive emotions. So someone like Jim Wilder or others would talk about how joy is the high energy version of love and connection. So joy, delight, things like that. Mm-hmm. And then peace is the low energy expression of that same kind of connection. So maybe anger and sadness are kind of the reverse of those.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I thought, Geoff, for Christians, when we, believed in Jesus, and that this sounds like what you're talking about sounds like a lot of work, what I'm saying, it sounds like a lot of work.
Sounds like the process of sanctification, right?
Oh, there you go. Okay. Yeah.
Well, and it has like diving down into this for almost 2 years now. And then you read across, you read to hopefully you and all the listeners, know this, by heart, Romans 12:2, to offer your bodies as a living act of worship and to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Mm. Like when you really like that, when you learn the brain science of things, it's like, well, maybe Paul meant that spiritually, but like in one sense, it's also neurologically true. Uh-huh. Like we need our mind renewed because they have all these bad, and it's not just enemies, because we don't all respond to enemies with anger, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of us respond with hunker down, run away. Yeah. And neither of those responses necessarily are authentic, right? And it is interesting that Paul links that to, then you'll be able to discern the good will of God. Mm-hmm. And so when we're not having the mind of Christ and we're not integrated, we're not viewing people, as image bearers, but rather just as enemies or as threats and things like that, then we're not able to discern what God's will is in this instance. Mm-hmm. Before this person, I can't find God's will when I'm running or fighting. So then the other thing too is, since we're just going to keep going the brain science thing, but so there is like mindfulness, and that's more of just like meditating and just like thinking. Mm-hmm. But there is a lot of people connect with like gratitude and thankfulness to the process of reintegrating your mind. And I kind of read that as a way of telling your mind, like, I'm not in danger. When you practice gratitude, you name the things that are good in your life. Mm-hmm. You name the gifts God has given to you and the people that, bring you joy. When you do that, you're basically telling your mind and therefore your whole body, I'm at peace. I'm not being attacked. I have what I need. Mm-hmm. It's very much a centering process. It's a calming, centering thing. And it's no wonder that the psalmist would say things like, I enter I enter your courts with praise. Mm-hmm. I enter, your temple with thanksgiving. And in one sense, like, we can connect with God and with other people the most when we practice praise and thanksgiving, because it lets us see those people as people, mm-hmm. not as to be used or conquered or to run away from and things like that. Yeah. So it's just, but yes, it's a difficult process. I was talking with a friend, like I've been in the 20, my whole adult life, so I'm 41, but mm-hmm. most of my adult life of trying to left brain myself into a more right brain stance. And the right brain is more connected with your body and more connected with people and more connected with your emotions, whereas your left brain is very analytical, and I'm a super analytical person. So I'm like reading all these research books just so that I can connect with people better, mm-hmm. Yeah. Which sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually been working for me a little bit.
Yeah.
Like, how can we connect with people better is, in one sense, the goal of, I think,
Yeah, I have a friend, and I know a lot of people have probably heard of this idea of doing like gratitude journaling, where you each morning write three things that you're thankful for. And I think the idea is that they don't need to be big things. They actually need to be small and simple things. because sometimes we feel like overwhelmed by the big, trying to be thankful for all these big things, or we're overwhelmed by the big things in our lives maybe, and so being thankful for the small things helps us shift that way of thinking, and then we get a little more practice at that, and then be able to be thankful for those things. There was something else I was going to say, and I'm totally forgetting now, but that's okay. This is really good. I love this brain science stuff. I think it's really helpful connecting to the way that our brains function. It helps me. Oh, I remember what it was. I tend to be a perfectionist. For the Enneagram nerds out there, I'm a 1.
Ooh,
yeah.
Wow,
and
you
so
live with lots of condemnation there, don't you? Self-criticism.
I know. I do.
I'm a 3, so I just think I'm awesome at everything.
Yeah. You are awesome. You are awesome. You don't need me. You don't need me to say that. I know.
No, I don't. I appreciate it, but I truly don't need that.
So one thing that people like me do is I'm really good at noticing what's wrong. Right. So I'm really, really good at walking into a room. This drives my wife and completely nuts, because if I come home, the first thing I notice is like, there's a mess over here. This wasn't put away. Like I name all the things in the room that are wrong. And so when I engage with people, or when I'm thinking about things even, or even at work, right? I see the things that are wrong that need to be fixed. The good side of that is I think I see what can be better. The shadow side, the dark side of that is that I can be very critical and judgmental. And so for me, coming into these conversations, realizing for people who are very critical, are good at seeing the flaws in arguments maybe, or good at seeing what needs to be better, that practice of thankfulness, that practice of gratitude and joy helps short circuit that a little bit. It helps you practice thinking of those positive things first, and being able to think in our example of somebody posting something on Facebook, so maybe somebody had a bad day, or maybe something happened in their life that I don't know about that makes them feel this way. There's a story there that I don't know. I don't need to rush to the judgment, because that's what I'm really good at.
Yeah. It creates more of that compassionate curiosity rather than, just go for it.
Yeah. Another practice that I continue to work on, and won't say that I'm very good at, but I do find it helpful, is centering prayer. And in that method of prayer, it's a little different. It's different than mindfulness, and it's a little different than some other contemplative prayer methods. There's a lot of letting go. And I find that's another thing we're not very good at. I know I'm not very good at. Maybe other people that you and I don't know, or that I don't interact with, seem really good at letting go. My wife is really good at letting go. She's like, we don't need to keep having this conversation. And I'm like, what do you mean we don't need to have this conversation? I'm the one beating a dead horse. No, we got to get through all of this stuff. And the practice of letting go of your own thoughts. Ooh, yeah, it's hard work, but it's really, really good and really, really helpful. So for this idea of being able to just step back enough to start figuring out how do we love our enemies, being able to let go of something is maybe the first step, right? We can't even pause. We can't even take a break until we can let go of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That bringing just peace to yourself. A lot of times we think that if we could bring peace to that situation outside of us, then I'll have peace inside of me. But really, I think Christ always calls us to work the other way around. Like, okay, we need to bring peace into the turmoil of our hearts by looking further, instead of just next to us or down the road. We need to look up, know, like in God's kingdom, I am safe. Like right now, no matter what's happening. My finances suck. I just got fired. I got framed, by a coworker. I don't know what, right? But like big picture, in the kingdom of God, I am safe, and God's kingdom is not about to fail. It's not about to falter. And so I can be at peace. I don't have to and then I can work toward peace, in the people. And I think you talk about like really strict training. And the truth is it does take training and like the peace process. So like in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and like all the people during protests, they would go through rigorous training. They would do mock protests where basically they had drill sergeants just like beating on them like in churches and calling them terrible things so that they could learn like, oh, if someone yelled such and such and such, like I would want to punch them in the face. Oh, okay. I have to figure out how to bring peace to myself so that when we actually march, I don't punch them in the face. Like, and so the church in one sense in spiritual formation needs to be that place where it's safe to fail in the midst of those relationships. But then there's, like how do we practice it? That's where I think confession is really important as a kind of going along with the thankfulness. Is just owning like, oh yeah, I blew that. Like that was me. Yep. That wasn't you. That wasn't because you left your clothes out. That wasn't because the laundry was still wet and you forgot to move it from the washer to the dryer. Like that was like, I was just angry. I was ready to be angry and you were my excuse. And confessing those things, as a way to bring peace. I mean, it's amazing. I'm sure you've experienced this with your kids and other people. When you confess that you were wrong, peace enters the situation so much faster than before that happened. And so, so confession and thanksgiving, I think those are, but that never happens online, right? Have you ever seen anyone confess like, oh, like you're right. I totally took your quote out of context and I misread your statement. I didn't even read that article. I just went off like, no, no one ever says that, right? Yeah. I just saw your headline and I went crazy.
Right. Exactly. You mentioned the civil rights movement, and that kind of brings me to a final question. Something that I as I have these conversations about how do we have better conversations, how do we deal with difficult topics, how do we have disagreements better, one thing that I keep thinking about, and I want to talk to more people about, is the idea that sometimes that's kind of a bit of a privilege. And we're talking about enemies today, and so this is a good entryway into talking about literal enemies. We have a lot of in the United States in the last few years this resurgence of neo-Nazis and the alt-right, white supremacists being much more open and much more willing to be out in public. Aside from actual white supremacists, I think everybody kind of agrees that we don't want that, right? And so we might label them enemies. In that, we don't want that to be the norm. We don't want that to continue to be okay and acceptable. And for people that are maybe more threatened by that ideology than you or I, we're both white, we're both men, the conversation about how do we have nice dialogue, I think sometimes probably comes off as a little bit privileged when people say, well, my actual security and safety is a little bit threatened. And I do really, really believe strongly that what you and I are talking about today has something to say even to those contexts. But I struggle with it. So what do you say to this idea that like, well, it's nice to talk about dialogue, but there are times where dialogue, we can't have dialogue, and there are actual enemies, like in Charlottesville when Heather Heyer was killed, and the president said that there were good people on both sides. It really bothered a lot of people because it was a way of saying like, well, we're not going to really call them enemies, or we're not really going to call it out as something we need to denounce. And I think some people feel like when we call for dialogue or niceness or politeness, and I don't think it's the same thing, but the fear from some people would be we're gonna allow for things that should not be allowed. And that I know that's probably a whole nother episode, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this idea of loving our enemies, and we're addicted to hating our enemies, and things that we can do to change that in ourselves. What does that have to say about these conversations where it's a little bit difficult? And there might be a question of like, well, maybe there are enemies, and we want to name them in some way as such. I don't know. What's your thoughts?
I have thoughts.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, maybe we should do another episode. I think one, Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for your enemies. He doesn't say, don't have any enemies. And I think sometimes people, not that Jesus was seeking to create enemies, but the way, especially with those in power, he did make enemies because he was proclaiming the truth, and then he was befriending the wrong people, right? So he's messing with the structure. And so that's, and I don't know if that's quite an answer, but I think it gets toward an answer. So Jesus isn't calling us to be nice. He is calling us to treat our enemies as people, and that we should pray for our enemies as a process for remembering that they are people. But that doesn't mean that we're nice and cordial, and it certainly doesn't mean we have dialogues. Like Jesus didn't necessarily have dialogues with people that viewed him as an enemy. He just called them out and kind of named what they were doing. Some to, very biting effect. But that's different than just unloading on them willy-nilly. So I think sometimes we think of like Jesus's action in the temple courts of cleaning it out kind of as this hot-headed response to a situation. But that's probably not the case. Like in one sense, it was probably a cold, calculated, prophetic action that was, certainly in the moment, impassioned. But like he wasn't like his emotions were not ruling him. Like I think he had a very clear picture and a very thought out reason for doing those things. It's same with his parables and his attacks against the Pharisees and the scribes and things like that. Whereas for a lot of us, it's just like enemy, unload on them in all my righteous indignation and things like that. And so I think maybe that process, like we have an enemy and something serious needs to be done. Then, okay, I'm going to collect myself, discern the will of God in the mind of Christ in that moment, Romans 12:2. And then let's do this and let's not now hold back at all. Like once we've discerned what the mind of Christ is in this situation, let's really do it. And that's different than, that's standing up to power. That's naming injustice. This is like the Hong Kong protests, against China are, very much within that. Like they're impassioned, but they're also very deliberate and calculated. That's different than a shooter comes into your church, who's a white nationalist. That, that's where your fight or flight responses do you good. That's why they're there, because they are literally there to save your life. And whatever action that you feel called to, is something you should do. And then, so those two things, like, I don't like, sometimes we can think, the fight or flight responses need to be total, like conquered by, just love and niceness and mutual dialogue. Well, I mean, if you're not being shot at and if you're not worried about your life, like tell that to a single woman who leaves church late in an evening or leaves, the business late in the evening. Like they have good reason for the bodily responses that they have in a dark alley. Right. Like there's reasons for those responses, and those are serving them well. And so when someone asks you, hey, can you walk me to my car? There's a reason for that. Like, so we don't need dialogue. I mean, certainly you want compassion and things like that. Right. So, but yes, as privileged white men that you and I are, like, we don't have as many of those situations probably, and we get to choose not to be in situations. I don't have to drive through those neighborhoods, and so this was part of the mark of our privilege is that we don't. So then we manufacture them online. So anyways, we can go into a whole cultural about all this stuff. We have all this, white male energy that doesn't, blah, blah, blah. I don't know what I'm going to say. I should probably stop.
No, we should definitely plan to have another episode, because it's really, I knew it was kind of a big question, and I didn't expect you to answer it in a like complete way, but I love your answer. I think it's very helpful to say that there are different contexts for different things, and dialogue works in certain contexts and it's not going to work in others, and there are times where it's not going to work because there is somebody we have named an enemy for a reason, and I appreciate that a lot, especially that Jesus doesn't say we won't have enemies, and I think that's also very, very helpful when sometimes when we're talking about this stuff, working on our own issues and getting to places that are more healthy. Some people end up in a very sort of positivity, self-helpy kind of space, and I think people get worried that that's the end result of what you and I've been talking about for this episode. So yeah, thanks for that answer. Well, I do want to respect your time, and I want to wrap up with 3 questions There's a lot that we could pull from in this conversation, and I thank you so much. Lots of really good book recommendations. I have a lot of reading to do after this episode. But I like to have answer three questions, something that we learned or something we were reminded of, something that we can do or an action step that people can take, and then a resource. We've recommended a lot of resources, but if there are any others or if you want to plug something, that would be great. And I'll go first. Something that I learned a lot about brain science, and I really appreciate that. That's very interesting. I really liked when you were explaining emotions in the brain that go up and emotions that go down. I had never had that image before, and that was super helpful in just thinking about how different emotions function in our brains and in our bodies when we're having those emotions. And I look forward to reading more about that. Something we can do is actually from an article that you linked to also on Facebook on the neuroscience of breaking negativity or breaking negative mindsets. And I found that really helpful. We've kind of already touched on these 3 steps, but I want to reiterate them as something we can do, since the topic that brought us here today was, when we get kind of addicted to hating people on Facebook for their comments or what they're saying, how do we respond differently, and how do we find a more loving and compassionate response? And so I'll link to this article in the show notes, but the first step is notice your negativity bias. And I appreciate that. That's that stopping step, that pause, that ability to get curious and go, oh, what am I doing? Why is this happening? And thinking about it, and notice that you are having a bias towards negativity in this situation, whether it's being negative about the person or the situation or whatever else is going on. And then 2, the second step is shifting to a moment of gratitude. There was an episode of another podcast, I think Everything Happens with Kate Bowler, which is one of my current favorites, where someone tells a story. No, it wasn't. It was another podcast that I'm hoping to have a guest from this podcast called Swoon on, and they're both therapists. And she was talking about jealousy, and this moment where she had felt jealousy for her partner who was talking a lot to someone else, and she went to the bathroom and had this moment of gratitude and started just naming a few things, like, I'm very thankful for my partner. I like a lot of things about them. I'm thankful that other people see how great they are too, and how that helped shift her from this negative perspective of jealousy towards being grateful and being thankful. And we've mentioned a couple of things about that. And then the third step is rewire your brain. Taking time to sit with your new mindset and trying, like you were saying before, when we practice some of those things, it rewires our brain to begin to be able to handle them differently, and change our responses to those things. And I'll recommend a book that I'm reading right now on centering prayer. I find it's a really, really good practice. Cynthia Bourgeault has a book called, I'll link to it in the show notes if I get the title wrong, but it's Centering Prayer and Inner Awakeness or Inner Awareness. I'm not remembering, but it's a really helpful, really good book on practicing centering prayer. And it is from a Christian perspective, and I'll recommend that. So, Geoff, what's something we learned, something we can do, and any resources or things that you want to plug? You have a lot of stuff going on, so please plug away.
Well, the things I learned, man, I should have been paying more attention. I kept, my brain was always running on. So the things that I know this is terrible, but now I'm like, Everything Happens in Swoon. Like, these are the 2 podcasts I just learned about. Cool. Download, because I have never heard of those. So that's good. The trouble is since I'm moving from Chicago, I no longer have a commute, so I'm not listening to podcasts as much as I used to. But I love the podcast. So whenever I'm on long car trips, I always catch up on them really quick.
You have to do more dishes.
I know, it's true.
That's when I listen.
That's true. Well, thankfully my teenage kids often do the dishes. I know, right? So nice. There are benefits of having teenagers a little bit. No, they're great. I love my kids. So I'm gonna go check those out. As far as what to do is, like you mentioned, the gratitude journal, and that's like half of maybe the prayer of examine too. Is that's something that I always think about and know about, and I'm like, I should do that more. And I actually did do the examine last night, which is where you, for those of you listening who might not know, the prayer of examine is where you kind of focus on the areas, the technical words I think are consolation and disconsolation, or where were you comforted, or where were you at peace, where did you see God at work, and then where did you feel that God was absent, or how did you feel abandoned, and just being aware of those kind of two sides. But the gratitude journal is obviously focused on the positive end of that. So I think that would be a good practice for me. It was funny as you were talking about being a one and noticing how things could be fixed, and you probably have like a moral judgment about that, like it's out of order and that's wrong. The universe is wrong, right?
Yeah.
For me as a 3, I have a similar critical eye, but like my moral reasoning, I guess, if what you were to call it that, is not the same as the 1s, but it's more of just an efficiency factor. And so if things are out of place, but it doesn't make my house or my life inefficient, then it doesn't matter. But if something's out of place, like I have special pens, like I have the pens that I use for everything and no one else is allowed to, but if my pens are missing or if they're gone, it's like, then it's inefficient, it's broken down. And so anyhow, I don't know why I brought that up. Anyways, there we go. I was thinking maybe there'd be a good podcast if you haven't done Enneagram stuff already. Like maybe have my wife on because she's a little more up on the Enneagram. I love the Enneagram.
Yeah, that would be great.
Because you linked like what gratitude would mean for a 1, and I was wondering like that might be interesting to go all the way around to the 9. Like what different work does gratitude do for different numbers? Like that would actually be. That'd be pretty sweet. So you can take that if you just use that with another guest. Like, go ahead. Yeah. Then the last thing, book-wise, is I did bring it up. I brought up a lot of books, I guess, that you've probably written down. But I think if anyone's like, oh, how can I get a little bit of this brain science, but then a little bit of spiritual information, I would go with Kurt Thompson's The Soul of Shame. The Soul of Shame. He has another one called The Anatomy of the Soul, but it's a little denser. He tells a lot of good stories in both books, so the information's carried along by stories. But I would start with The Soul of Shame. And I actually plugged, we used a little bit of his work in the book that my wife and I did. It's coming out in January, called Does God Really Like Me? And we're really focusing on kind of this idea of like, yeah, I know God loves me, but does he really like me? Like, does he want me around? And we try to tell the whole story of Scripture with a lot of personal stories with the eye of God really wants to be with you. Like the whole story of Scripture is God moving toward humanity because he delights in us and he's not disgusted with us and he wants to partner with us. And so we go through, but we use quite a bit of the Soul of Shame in that. And then we're also starting a podcast together following a similar theme, but it's called the God With Us podcast, where we're going to be talking with professionals, but also pastors, but also just kind of ordinary lay people, and just hearing stories of exploring how God's presence interacts with our lives in different ways, and then how that we can find God's purposes or God's will in that. So we kind of look at these presence and purpose of God in our lives. So it'll probably be a lot like this conversation with different people, particularly about the theme of God with us.
Yeah, fantastic.
So that'll be dropping, actually, I don't know when you're going to post this episode, but it's going to be coming out next week. So the God With Us podcast.
Yeah, I will definitely link to it in the show notes. I'm excited to listen to it myself. So yeah. Geoff, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me and share so many resources and good knowledge. And hopefully we can all try to work on interacting a little better, learning how to love our enemies and break that addiction to hating our enemies online and offline.
Yeah, amen. Amen. Well, so glad to be a part of this. We Don't Talk About That podcast. It's sounds great.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on Support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?